So, let's hear from the first of our speakers. Professor Richard Silberstein is Professor Emeritus at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, my hometown, where he served as Head of Department of Physics and was the founding director of the Brain Sciences Institute. Richard has 40 years of neuroscience research experience, and he's going to take us through how neuroscience works and show us how it can provide evidence of consumer engagement with media. Please welcome Richard.
Thank you. I think the slides work. Thank you very much for that introduction. I should also say that I'm here in my capacity as Chairman of Neuroinsight as well, multitasking. As was pointed out, what I'd like to do is share some really exciting insights that we've developed over the years looking at the interface between neuroscience research and communication services research. And that's really what Neuroinsight is about. A little bit about ourselves. The company uses a brain imaging technology that was developed in our laboratory and has subsequently been used throughout the world, primarily in biomedical research. For example, my particular areas of academic research looking at brain function connectivity in relation to such disorders as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and most recently we've published some interesting, I think it's interesting, work on brain functional connectivity and creativity. So that's the academic sort of track. The technology is very sensitive. It's called steady state topography. There's a bit of text up there, but our headquarters, where all the data is analysed, is based in Melbourne, with offices in New York and London. We've more or less conducted studies throughout the world. The only continent that's escaped us is Antarctica. And more generally, the data is recorded anywhere in the world. The equipment is relatively portable, etc. So let's move on. What I'm going to show you now is images of brain activity, where warmer colours represent increased brain activity and cooler colours lower levels of activity. The main thing I want you to look at is just how rapidly the changes take place. These are average activity in two groups of people, 50 in each, demographic 1, demographic 2, looking at the same piece of content. So here we go. So the main point is that there are very rapid changes, regions light up, cool down, etc. What that actually means, I'll explain. I'll just let it finish. Right, so what do all those colours mean? Well, the fact of the matter is we can interpret those because different regions of the brain perform different functions. Essentially, the back of the brain, this region back here, is the visual cortex. So when that region is active, you are paying visual attention to something. If the left hemisphere is more active than the right, you're paying attention to detail. Conversely, if the right hemisphere is more active than the left, you're paying attention to the big picture. That's interesting. There's a region, it's a bit difficult to see the cursor, back here, associated with emotional intensity, how strong an emotion is, irrespective whether it's positive or negative. The frontal regions of the brain, when they light up, occur when you encounter something that is of personal relevance to you. It might be a photo of a friend, it could be a musical instrument you play, it doesn't really matter. If it's of personal relevance to you, and particularly if you're involved in something in a sense of immersion, that region lights up. We'll hear more about that as well. The very frontal parts, the left and right hemispheres do different things. The left hemisphere is more active when you encounter something that you find attractive. Generally, it's because it's likable. Right hemisphere, by contrast, is more active when you withdraw, fear, anxiety, etc. So the balance between left and right, we call that hedonic valence or approach withdrawal, whether you are attracted to or repelled by something. Now, the final section I want to discuss, the cursor is not it's difficult to see them. This region around here, these regions light up when something is occurring, you're experiencing something which is going strongly into long-term memory. Now, long-term memory I define as anything from 20 minutes to a lifetime. The sort of experience, what you had for breakfast yesterday, for example, or something like that. That's in long-term memory. But the important point I want to make is that it is both conscious long-term memory, explicit long-term memory, and also implicit or unconscious long-term memory. Many memories that you have, most memories that you have are actually unconscious, but they still have an effect on one's behavior. And we can actually measure what's going in. We're not measuring what's in there, we're measuring what's going in. The left hemisphere is more concerned with new experiences and particularly detail, text, message, etc. The right hemisphere more concerned with the global picture, the big picture. And memory is one of the most important measures. So let's just move on. Okay, how we actually measure the activity. People wear, I can't call it a fashionable bathing cap, but it's a black cap with sensors which pick up the activity from different regions of the brain. They also have a visor which produces a dim flicker in the periphery, which enables us to pick up the speed of processing in different parts of the brain. The crucial thing about this methodology is it picks up different speeds. When a part of the brain is active, it speeds up, and vice versa. What I'm going to show you now is an example of what the data looks like with a rather famous Cadbury's Gorilla advertisement. You'll see two traces, a red one and a blue one. The red one is the level of activity in this left memory side. In other words, what is going in to left memory. Anything above that top dotted line is strongly encoded. That's 0.7, and anything below the bottom line, the 0.3, is as if it's never actually occurred. In other words, anything between there is actually going in and having an effect on behaviour, and above 0.7, strongly so. So let's actually have a look at it. Okay, famous ad. Not sure. Oh, okay, whoops. Okay, there were 3 points in time where there were peaks with memory encoding, particularly left hemisphere memory encoding. The first one where you first see the gorilla, and that's strongly encoded. The second one where it pans back and you see the drum set. And then the final one where the branding occurs. Those peaks in memory encoding are extremely important, and we'll come back to those as well. Now, from our criteria, we use long-term memory encoding as probably the most important measure of likely commercial effectiveness. So looking at that, we would have said straight away, wow, that is going to be highly effective. So what did traditional research say about that? Well, traditional research said, in fact, you can sort of see the bottom there, under no circumstances, essentially, you will never show this ad. All the sort of various criteria, what does it tell you about the product, the brand has, et cetera, they were below benchmarks. The benchmarks are in grey, the Cadbury purple bars are what it's called there. It was, from terms of traditional testing, it was a bit of a disaster. And yet, sales, Cadbury milk chocolate increased 9%. Respect for the brand increased by 24%. And even the tune climbed the charts as well, and of course it won a Cannes Gold Line. So this is where quite clearly looking directly at the brain can give you insights that traditional methodologies don't. They do tell you something, but they can only tell you what people can verbalize or what they can communicate by symbolic communication. Okay. We have a number of metrics. The ones that I want to talk about, I've mentioned long-term memory encoding, and we've published a number of papers on that, scientific papers and papers, commercial applications. Other areas, other measures, as I've mentioned, engagement, approach withdrawal, and emotional intensity. I've pointed out the regions of the brain that are associated with those. We carry on about memory, and I would have to say probably most of you have sort of heard people talk about memory, and you probably think it's a bit boring. You really want something a bit more exciting, maybe give me emotion or engagement or something like that. But we think, from a neuroscience point of view, we may have misunderstood the very nature of long-term memory. We assume that long-term memory is a little bit like this metaphor that I put up there of a Victorian library. It's just a repository of information. What you did on your 25th birthday, go up to the book, find out, etc. Passive. But recent research on the nature of memory, particularly by Danny Schachter at Harvard, shows a different light altogether. When you ask people in a scanner to, MRI scanner, to remember something 2 or 3 years ago, a specific date, for example, certain regions of the brain become active and they form a network, a particularly characteristic network. Now, that's interesting, and most of the things you would sort of expect. But if you then say, stop remembering, now I want you to imagine what you'll be doing in 2 years' time. Not 2 years back, 2 years into the future. The very same networks light up. And that has led people to think now that we may have misunderstood the nature of long-term memory. Rather than being a simple repository of past information, it's in fact evolved to guide future behavior. And this is important because if information about key message branding is strongly encoded, it is indicating that the brain considers this of relevance for future behavior. So, what's the evidence for that? We've published stuff, oh heavens, going back 2008, where we saw in a laboratory study people's change in brand preference was correlated with the level of long-term memory at the time of key message or branding. This was in one of our studies here, where we looked at the correlation between the brand attribute as provided by the client who conducted this independently through another firm and our measure of neural activity. And there's a pretty robust correlation of over 0.65 there. Also, one of our UK studies where we looked at actual sales, where in different campaigns where the client was able to provide us with the impact of the advertising and the sole source, and there it was an exponential correlation of about 0.86, which is a pretty robust correlation. So we feel there is strong evidence for the link between long-term memory especially and change in consumer behaviour and attitude, and that's based on good science as well as external validation. I now want to just come to a concept which we've developed, the so-called iconic trigger. This is memory encoding for a particular advertisement shown during, in this case, a television program. And there are these peaks and troughs that you saw earlier. And if you remember with the Cadbury gorilla, there were those 3 massive peaks. Now, they actually have a very specific meaning, particularly in the way the brain stores information. When you're storing memories and experiences, they don't all go in with equal strength like a tape recorder. Certain scenes, certain experiences are stored strongly, others much less so. Those scenes that are stored most powerfully are the ones the brain uses to reconstruct a memory. If I were to ask you what was the last movie you saw, you'd mention a name, tell me about the plot. Your brain would not go to the opening scenes. Your brain would go to a particular scene within the movie that really grabbed you, and you would then reconstruct the sequence. So those peaks that you're seeing here are the hooks, or what we call the iconic triggers that the brain uses to store that entire information. They're also the hooks that it uses to link to other things as well. So if, for example, we take that image from the ad, the pack of Panadol on a set of architectural slides, architectural drawings, and then use that, for example, in different platforms. Text of various kinds, such as print, out of home, digital, etc. It's an extraordinarily powerful way of integrating the various consumer brand touch points, because in fact you're using the very language that the brain itself uses to link those messages together using the iconic trigger. And here's an example where, for example, a television commercial scene that was used in digital advertising there. And so having seen, for example, a television ad, if you see that in print or out of home, using the iconic triggers, it's almost as if you're pressing a replay button. So that's the main thing I want to leave you with. Thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully long-term memory encoding.